at this point in time, Gabriel, the situation in international bond markets has remained orderly. And so we have a situation where fiscal space is becoming more constrained, and the factors that you listed contribute to that being so. At this point in time, the major central banks in the world are pivoting towards fighting inflation. That leads to a tightening of the global credit cycle, and the countries that are most vulnerable to shifting financing conditions are being hit the hardest. If you look at yield spreads, you see that there are already a number of non-systemic emerging market countries that post extremely high yield differentials. And if you go to low income developing countries, you see that according to our analysis, 60% or almost 60% of these countries are already in debt distress or at high risk of debt distress. But debt risks apply to all country groups. And when you concentrate on advanced economies, you realize that inflation surprises may have helped. They actually have helped debt dynamics in 2021, but favorable financing conditions in bond markets require credible price stability, and therefore the tightening of the monetary conditions is actually something that treasuries should welcome, because it promises the delivery of a credible price stability in the future, which provides favorable situations for the financing of public debt. And that's particularly relevant for countries that have elevated public debt.
Mhm. But do you see this, fiscal space being constrained globally continue in the future? Because IMF managing director has said that the Russia-Ukraine situation has impacted the world in more ways than one. We're seeing that COVID is still lingering. So do you see this trend to continue?
So we have a situation where Russia invasion of Ukraine has exacerbated uncertainties in the world, exactly in line with what the managing director has emphasized. One aspect which is particularly dramatic, I believe, and allows one to illustrate the point in a way which is very concrete, is just think about food prices. Food prices were already high and rising at the end of 2021. With war in the Ukraine, major exporters of staple foods were affected by the conflict. That led to further increases in food prices. And of course, that fuels ongoing inflation in line with the argument that we exchanged a moment ago. But the point that I want to emphasize now is a different one. The increase in food prices affects the most vulnerable most. And the most vulnerable may be the poorest households in one given country, but that's also true for the poorest countries in the world. So, as it is crucial in any of our countries that the households that are most vulnerable receive support so they can still access, they can still buy, they can still acquire an adequate nutrition, it is very important that the global community comes together and supports the most vulnerable countries in the world that are very vulnerable to this shock. Just think that there are countries in the world where the average share of spending on food is as high as 60% when the average for advanced economies in the same indicator is about 10. So the shock may be the same, but the effect of the shock is completely different. And we have to be aware of the importance of these divergences.
Mhm. Speaking of different country groups and common goal, the report highlights the importance of building climate resilience. But for different country groups, with everything else that's been happening, how should they prioritize their policy goal, to achieve this?
So at this point in time, we are also facing an energy crisis. And in the context of an energy crisis, countries will have to try to see how they can best adapt in the short run. And likely that will imply an increase in the burning of fossil fuels. But as you know, in order for us to be able to achieve the Paris targets on climate change, we will need to reduce emissions by the end of the decade, by 2030, by 25 to 50%. So if the response at this point in time entails burning additional fossil fuels, we will need to adapt going forward so that we correct our policies so as to still deliver our objectives, our targets by the end of the decade. And there's another way of looking at this. On the one hand, one must respond to the needs of the present, but the current high prices of energy and the volatility in energy prices really shows the importance of diversifying the portfolio of energy sources, and in particular to base that on renewables. And if you think about that from this viewpoint, there's a complementarity between energy security and the green transition agenda.
Mhm. And last question, let's zoom into China. We've been talking about how China's fiscal support has been bridging over the economic impact from COVID. So from the latest projection, how's the fiscal capacity, fiscal space in China look like?
So, the way I believe we should look at it has to do with the situation where China is right now. China, as we have spoken many times in the past, is in a growth model transition, which is being managed gradually over time. China is in a process of deleveraging in order to guarantee financial stability. China is still struggling with health policy in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, and it is applying a zero COVID policy in the face of a highly contagious variant of the virus, which is challenging the current situation in China, imposing additional lockdowns and disturbance in economic and financial activity. At this point in time, the momentum of the Chinese economy is slowing, and therefore, in order to maintain growth, additional support is necessary. So there are many balls in the air. There is a juggling act that the authorities in China will have to perform, hopefully successfully. And China does have the room to maneuver to offer additional fiscal support in the immediate future. Going forward, at some point in time, fiscal consolidation will be necessary. The stabilization and eventual decline in the public debt to GDP ratio will occur. and that will be something that ideally will happen in line with the development strategy of China. Now, fiscal policy, as we have discussed in the past, can help these adjustments from a structural viewpoint. Just think about moving away from the traditional priority on infrastructure and more towards policies that support domestic spending, in particular of the household sector. But more broadly, if you allow me, Gabriel, China is one of the main stakeholders of the global economy. And so, a very important contribution from China is absolutely necessary for the world to be able to put forward global solutions. And if I were to give you my top three, I would very much welcome full engagement of China on climate change, debt, and development. Climate change, debt, and development, Gabriel.
Do you mean
Thank you.
debt elimination for poor countries when you say debt?
That means contributing as a major stakeholder uh, for solutions of liquidity and solvency problems associated with that, including orderly resolution if that is necessary.
Mhm. All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Gaspar.
Thank you so much.